Get out of my house! You want to chase pipe dreams instead of reality? See how far that gets you without our support." My father's words hit harder than any physical blow as I stood frozen in our living room, the acceptance letter from Westridge Art Institute still clutched in my trembling hand. My mother sat silently on the couch, eyes downcast, refusing to look at me or challenge my father's verdict. I was 18 years old, high school diploma barely in hand, and I had just been told to leave the only home I'd ever known, all because I wanted to study photography instead of accounting. "You have until tomorrow morning," my father said, his voice cold as he straightened his tie. "Pack what you can carry. Anything else stays behind. It belongs to this family, and you've made it clear you don't want to be part of it." Before we jump into my story, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Olivia Reeves. Growing up in suburban Chicago, my parents had my life planned out with military precision. My father, Richard, was a senior partner at an accounting firm his family had built over 2 generations. My mother, Diana, managed their social calendar and philanthropic appearances with the same attention to detail my father gave tax codes. The day I was born, they opened a college fund earmarked for Northwestern's accounting program. By the time I was 5, I had a personalized leather-bound planner where my mother tracked my enrichment activities, piano lessons, math tutoring, etiquette classes, all designed to create the perfect successor to the Reeves financial legacy. I tried to be the daughter they wanted. I maintained straight A's, joined the debate team, served as treasurer for student council. I wore the modest clothes they approved, attended the country club functions where they introduced me to clients' sons, and smiled through endless dinners where the conversation revolved around tax law and investment strategies. But behind closed doors, I had a secret life. Photography became my escape, my passion, my true voice. I saved babysitting money for months to buy my first camera, a used DSLR from a pawn shop that I kept hidden in my school locker. I would take the long way home, photographing abandoned buildings, elderly couples on park benches, children playing in sprinklers, moments of authentic life that felt so distant from my carefully constructed existence. My best friend Emma was the only one who knew. She would cover for me when I snuck away to photograph street festivals or urban landscapes. "You see the world differently," she told me once, flipping through my photos. "Like you're capturing something the rest of us miss." During my junior year, one of my teachers discovered my work when I accidentally submitted a memory card with homework on it that also contained my photos. Instead of reporting my extracurricular activity to my parents, Ms. Hernandez entered my work in a youth arts competition. When I won first place, she begged me to tell my parents. "This is real talent, Olivia," she insisted. "They should be proud." I knew better. I accepted the award in secret and hid the certificate with my camera. But secrets have a way of surfacing. 3 days before high school graduation, my father was cleaning out his car when he found a brochure for Westridge Art Institute that had fallen from my bag. He confronted me at dinner, waving the glossy pages like evidence at a trial. "What is this?" he demanded. The moment had arrived, the collision of my 2 worlds that I'd feared and anticipated for years. I took a deep breath and told them everything: my photography, the competition I'd won, and my dream of studying visual arts instead of accounting. I thought, naively, desperately, that my accomplishments might change things, that they might finally see me. "It's just a phase," my mother said dismissively. "Absolutely not," my father stated, slicing his steak with mechanical precision. "We've invested too much in your future to watch you throw it away on something so impractical." "It's my future," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "And I've already applied. I've been accepted, with a scholarship." The silence that followed was deafening. Then my father carefully placed his silverware on his plate. If you pursue this, you do it without our support, financial or otherwise. I thought it was a negotiation tactic, a bluff to bring me back in line. 2 weeks later, after countless arguments where my voice grew stronger and their positions more entrenched, I received my acceptance package from Westridge. Full details of my partial scholarship, housing information, and a welcome letter praising my exceptional eye and technical promise. The joy I felt holding that envelope gave courage. That night at dinner, I placed it on the table. "I've decided," I said simply. "I'm going to Westridge." What followed wasn't another argument. It was an execution. My father informed me that my college fund would be frozen. My car, technically in his name, would stay in the garage. My health insurance, cell phone plan, everything that had tethered me to financial security would be cut. "You're making a choice," he said coldly. "Choices have consequences." "Richard," my mother interjected, her only resistance in the entire confrontation. "Perhaps we should—" "No," he cut her off. "She needs to understand what she's walking away from." I looked at my mother, silently pleading for support, but she folded like she always did. Her eyes dropped to her plate, shoulders slightly hunched. The physical embodiment of surrender I'd seen countless times when my father made proclamations. That's when I realized I'd seen my future if I stayed. I would become my mother, a shadow person, existing in the negative space around a dominant personality, with hopes and dreams compressed into such a small corner of life they could barely breathe. "I understand exactly what I'm walking away from," I said, standing up from the table. The next morning, I packed everything I could fit into 2 suitcases and my school backpack: clothes, my camera equipment, the journal where I'd pasted my favorite photos, and the award certificate I'd hidden for so long. I left behind the pearls they'd given me for my 16th birthday, the monogrammed luggage intended for business, trips, the expensive watch that had been my graduation present. My mother caught me at the door, pressing $500 bills into my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes darting toward my father's home office. This is all I could get without him noticing. I wanted to hate her for her weakness, but all I felt was pity and a determination never to become her. "I'll be okay," I told her, though I had no idea if that was true. Emma's family let me sleep on their couch for 2 weeks while I figured out my next steps. The partial scholarship wouldn't cover housing, and Westridge's semester wouldn't start for another 2 months. I needed to find a place to live and a way to support myself. The $500 my mother had given me wouldn't last long in Chicago. With Emma's help, I found a tiny room for rent in a house shared by 4 other students and a weekend job waiting tables at a diner near campus. I would need more, but it was a start. When I called my mother to give her my new address, more out of hope than expectation, my father answered. "She doesn't want to speak with you," he said flatly. "You've made your choice." I could hear her in the background, the muffled sound of her voice asking who was calling, but the line went dead before she could come to the phone. That summer burned itself into my memory as the hardest and most liberating time of my life. I worked 2 jobs, the diner on weekends and a coffee shop on weekdays. I learned to stretch $20 for groceries across a week, to sew up holes in my clothes instead of replacing them, to find free Wi-Fi instead of paying for internet. I also learned that I could survive. Each small victory, paying my rent on time, finding an even cheaper place to develop film, securing a campus job for the upcoming semester, built confidence I'd never been allowed to develop under my parents' roof. By the time orientation week arrived, I was exhausted but standing on my own 2 feet. The campus buzzed with other students my age, many dropped off by proud parents with new bedding and dorm supplies. I recognized the expensive luggage sets and carefully curated outfits, kids like I had been, stepping from one safe environment to another with the safety net of family support. I carried everything I owned in my 2 weathered suitcases, my camera bag held protectively close to my body. A boy with carefully styled hair and a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent gave me a curious look as I struggled up the stairs to the financial aid office. "Hey, do you need help with those?" he asked. "I've got it," I replied, perhaps too sharply. Independence had quickly taught me to be wary of help that might come with expectations. In the financial aid office, I discovered my first major obstacle. My scholarship required parental information for the FAFSA, even though my parents had made it clear they wouldn't be contributing. "Without their tax information, we can't process your federal aid," the counselor explained sympathetically. "The BAUSA scholarship is contingent on filing a complete FAFSA." My heart sank. I'd been so focused on making it to this point that I hadn't anticipated this bureaucratic roadblock. "Is there any way around this?" I asked, panic rising. "My parents have cut me off." The counselor's expression softened. She'd seen this before. "There is a dependency override process for special circumstances," she said, lowering her voice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It requires documentation, police reports, court documents, letters from counselors or clergy. "I don't have any of that," I admitted. "They didn't abuse me. They just disowned me." "Family estrangement can qualify," she said, sliding a form across the desk. "But you'll need to prove you're self-supporting and that reconciliation isn't possible." I left with a stack of forms and a deadline. I had 2 weeks to prove I was truly on my own before the scholarship would be reallocated to someone else. That night, sitting on the thin mattress in my rented room, I called my mother one last time. Maybe, I thought, if I explained the situation, if she understood I might lose this opportunity entirely, she would at least provide the tax information. My father answered again. This time, I didn't ask for my mother. "Dad," I said, swallowing my pride, "I just need your tax information for my FAFSA. You don't have to pay anything. I just can't get my scholarship without it." "Olivia," he said, his voice businesslike, as if addressing a difficult client. "We've been clear about our position. If you want to waste your potential on this art hobby, you do it without our involvement." "This isn't about the money," I insisted. "It's just paperwork." "It's about choices and consequences," he replied. "You chose to reject everything we've built for you. The consequence is independence, complete independence." I heard my mother in the background again, her voice slightly louder this time. "Richard, maybe we should just help with the forms." "Stay out of this, Diana," he snapped. Then, to me, "When you're ready to come home and follow the path we've set out, we'll talk. Until then, consider this a valuable lesson in reality." The line went dead again. I sat in the dark, phone in hand, tears streaming down my face. Not from sadness, but from pure rage. How could anyone be so callous to their own child? What kind of parent uses their children's dreams as bargaining chips? In that moment, something hardened inside me. A determination not just to survive, but to succeed so completely, so undeniably, that one day they would regret their cruelty. The next morning, I marched back to the financial aid office with a new plan. I'd done some research and learned about dependency override options. I brought letters from Emma's parents confirming I'd been staying with them, pay stubs from my jobs, and a detailed personal statement about my situation. The same counselor reviewed my documents, her face unreadable. "This is a good start," she said finally. "But we'll need more. A professional assessment would help, maybe from a therapist or social worker." I couldn't afford a therapist, but I found a community center with sliding-scale counseling services. The social worker listened to my story and provided a formal letter documenting my situation. I gathered bank statements showing I was supporting myself, and even a statement from my landlord. 2 days before the deadline, I submitted everything. 3 days after that, I received an email. Dependency override approved. My scholarship was secure. I could begin classes. That first semester was a blur of exhaustion, discovery, and growth. I worked 30 hours a week between my campus, job, and weekend shifts at the diner. I learned to function on minimal sleep, to take photographs in the stolen moments between responsibilities, to develop film in the cramped shared darkroom that smelled of chemicals and possibility. My first photography professor, Dr. Levine, noticed my worn clothes and tired eyes. After class one day, she stopped me. "Your work shows talent," she said directly, "but it also shows exhaustion. Are you taking care of yourself?" I gave her a sanitized version of my situation. She listened without interruption, then reached into her bag and pulled out a flyer. "The art department needs an assistant to manage. Equipment checkout," she said. "It pays better than the cafeteria, and the hours are more flexible. The last student graduated, and I'm in charge of hiring." I started the following week. The job gave me access to professional equipment I could never afford, flexible hours that accommodated my classes, and most importantly, a mentor. Dr. Levine became the first adult who seemed to genuinely believe in my potential, who critiqued my work honestly without crushing my spirit. "Your technical skills are solid," she told me, reviewing my portfolio midway through the semester. "But your best shots are the human ones, the ones that tell stories. You need to find your voice, your perspective." "I'm not sure I know what that is yet," I admitted. "Nobody does at 18, she said with a smile. "That's what these years are for." With her encouragement, I began a photo series documenting other students working night shifts, the hidden economy of young people, balancing education and survival, the barista studying biochemistry between customers, the delivery driver highlighting textbooks at red lights, the janitor writing poetry on break. When Dr. Levine submitted the series to a regional art competition without telling me, I was stunned to win second place and a $1,000 prize. "See," she said, showing me the judges' comments, "you found something to say." That prize money covered 2 months' rent, allowing me to reduce my working hours slightly and focus more on developing my portfolio. For the first time since leaving home, I could breathe, just a little. I didn't call my parents with the news of my award. What was the point? Instead, I opened a savings account and deposited half the prize money. If I'd learned anything, it was that I needed to build my own safety net. As freshman year ended, I faced the summer housing dilemma. The dorms would close, and my rented room's lease was ending. Dr. Levine connected me with another faculty member who needed a house sitter while she researched abroad. In exchange for watching her home and caring for her elderly cat, I could live rent-free for 3 months. It felt like winning the lottery. The house was small but comfortable, with a spare room I could use as a makeshift studio. For the first time in a year, I had space to breathe, to create without constant financial pressure hanging over me. I picked up extra shifts at the diner, saving every penny for the fall semester. I experimented with new techniques, building a portfolio that was increasingly focused and distinctive. I even began selling prints online, small income at first, but validation that my work had value. One evening, editing photos at the kitchen table, I realized something profound. I was happy. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. I was still precariously balanced on the edge of financial disaster. One medical emergency or unexpected expense could derail everything I'd built. But I was living authentically, creating work that mattered to me, making choices based on my own values rather than someone else's expectations. I wondered if my parents ever experienced that kind of happiness, or if they were too busy maintaining appearances and fulfilling obligations to know what it felt like. That night, for the first time in months, I dreamed about them. Not a nightmare of rejection, but something more complex. A dream where we sat at a table together, all of us different somehow. In the dream, my father looked at my photographs, with genuine interest. My mother spoke without checking his expression first. I woke up crying, mourning not the family I'd lost, but the family we could have been if they'd been able to see me. Really see me. Instead of the projection of their expectations. The next day, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do before. I created a folder of my best work, the pieces that had won recognition, that represented my clearest voice, and sent it to my mother's email with a simple message. This is what I'm building. She never responded. I told myself I hadn't expected her to, but the disappointment still stung. When sophomore year began, I returned to campus with more confidence and clarity. My portfolio was growing stronger. My financial situation, while still tight, was more stable thanks to my summer savings and increasing photography side gigs. I even had a small following on social media where I shared my work. What I didn't know was that someone had been watching my progress all along, someone who would change everything. My first fall semester at Westridge was a masterclass in survival. While other students complained about 8 a.m. classes and cafeteria food, I was juggling 3 jobs, sneaking free condiment, packets for makeshift meals, and learning to wash my hair in sinks when the shower in our shared house stopped working for a week. The house I shared with 4 other students was falling apart, mold creeping up bathroom walls, heaters that failed every other day, a landlord who considered returning phone calls an optional courtesy. But it was all I could afford, and compared to homelessness, it was a palace. Most mornings began at 4:30 a.m. for my opening shift at Cafe Solstice, where I'd prep pastries and brew coffee until rushing to class with the scent of espresso still clinging to my clothes. Evenings meant either waitressing at Gino's Diner or working the equipment checkout desk at the photography department. I'd collapse into bed around midnight, camera memory cards filled with images I barely had time to review, much less edit. Despite everything, my work began to stand out. My night shift photo series continued to grow, capturing the dignity and determination of students working their way through school. There was Marcus, the security guard studying biochemistry between rounds. Sasha delivering food while composing music in her head. Thomas, the janitor working on a PhD in literature, writing notes in the margins of poetry books during breaks. Professor Levine pushed me harder than the other students, something I only later realized was her way of acknowledging my potential. "This is good," she'd say, examining my contact sheets, "but it could be exceptional if you dig deeper. What are you trying to say about these people?" "That they exist," I answered once. "That their struggles matter." She nodded slowly. "Now we're getting somewhere." By mid-semester, I had developed a reputation in the department. Other students began asking me for technical advice, drawn to my unfussy approach to equipment and my ability to make compelling images with minimal resources. I couldn't afford the newest lenses or lighting kits that many of my classmates took for granted, so I'd become an expert at working with what I had: natural light, reflectors made from aluminum foil and cardboard, vintage manual lenses restored from thrift shops. "You don't need expensive gear to tell the truth," I told a freshman who complained about only having a basic camera. I showed him shots I'd taken with a 30-year-old film camera I'd rebuilt from parts. "You need to see what others miss." The semester's final project required submitting a portfolio for faculty review. While other students stressed over printing costs and presentation materials, I collected discarded mat board from the recycling bins and cut my own mats by hand, late at night in the empty studio. I couldn't afford the archival papers my classmates used, so I traded equipment monitoring shifts with another work-study student for access to the high-end printers after hours, using test paper that would otherwise be thrown away. When review day came, my presentation was modest compared to the elaborate portfolios and custom boxes and expensive frames. But the images, black and white portraits illuminated by natural light streaming through windows and doorways, each subject, caught in moments of focused determination, spoke for themselves. 3 of the 5 faculty members lingered at my display. I stood silently nearby, hands clasped to hide their trembling, as they discussed my work as if I wasn't there. "There's a maturity here I don't usually see in sophomores," said Professor Chen, the department chair. "The technical skills could use refinement," noted Professor Winters, known for his rigorous standards. "But the emotional content is undeniable." Dr. Levine smiled slightly. "She understands story. Everything else can be taught." When they moved on, Dr. Levine fell behind to whisper, "Weber Gallery, application on my desk by Friday." I looked it up immediately after the review. The Weber Summer Residency was a prestigious program for emerging photographers. A 3-month paid residency in New York, including studio space, equipment access, and mentorship from established artists. It was typically offered to graduate students or working professionals, not undergraduates, and certainly not sophomores who were still learning the fundamentals. That night, instead of sleeping, I assembled an application portfolio. I wrote my artist statement sitting on the floor of the bathroom, the only place with reliable light after my housemate blew a fuse using a space heater and hairdryer simultaneously. My personal essay explained my night shift series without mentioning my own circumstances. I didn't want pity or special consideration. I wanted my work judged on its merits alone. I slipped the completed application under Dr. Levine's office door before my morning shift at the cafe, certain I was wasting both our time, but unable to ignore the faint flicker of hope that had ignited. Winter break arrived with new challenges. The dorms closed, and while my housemates returned to family homes, I had nowhere to go. Emma invited me to stay with her family again, but they had relocated to Minneapolis. The cost of the trip and the reminder of my dependence on others' generosity felt too heavy. Instead, I arranged to house sit for one of the photography technicians who was traveling for the holidays. In exchange for watching his cats and watering plants, I'd have a warm place to stay and access to his darkroom setup in the basement. I picked up extra shifts at the diner, which stayed open through the holidays, serving people who, like me, had no family celebrations to attend. Christmas Day, I worked a double shift. The diner was nearly empty, just a few regulars, elderly men nursing coffees, a couple of international students unable to afford flights home, a middle-aged woman who left me a $50 tip with a note that simply said, "Keep going." That night, I treated myself to a proper meal with some of that tip money, setting up a card table in my temporary housing with a supermarket rotisserie chicken and a single candle. I allowed myself one moment of weakness, scrolling through social media to see photos of my parents' annual holiday party. There they were, smiling beside the 12-foot tree in the living room, glasses of champagne in hand, surrounded by colleagues and friends. My mother wore new pearls. My father sported a holiday bow tie. They looked happy, untroubled. My absence had left no visible mark. I shut my laptop and returned to the darkroom, channeling my emotions into my work. By morning, I had produced a series of prints that were different from anything I'd done before. Stark, high-contrast images of empty holiday tables, abandoned parking lots, storefronts closed for the season. Spaces defined by absence. When classes resumed in January, I showed these images to Dr. Levine during office hours. "These are different," she observed, studying them carefully. "More abstract, more painful." "Is that bad?" I asked. "No," she said quietly. "It's honest. You're finding your voice." She handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter from the Weber Gallery. I'd been selected as an alternate for the summer residency, not accepted outright, but on a wait list. If a primary candidate declined, I'd be offered their place. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Levine said. "They've never selected a sophomore before, not even as an alternate. You should be proud." It felt like partial validation, acknowledgement that my work had merit, even if not quite enough to secure the opportunity outright. I thanked her and tucked the letter into my bag, determined not to build false hopes around maybes and possibilities. The spring semester brought new challenges. My carefully constructed financial balance teetered constantly on the edge of collapse. A bout of flu cost me a week of work hours I couldn't afford to lose. The ancient car I'd purchased for $800 to commute to my weekend job required repairs that consumed an entire month's savings. My photography supplies dwindled, and I couldn't replace them. In March, during midterms, disaster struck. Returning home after a late shift, I found our house had been broken into. My room was ransacked, drawers emptied onto the floor, mattress slashed. My laptop, a refurbished model I'd purchased with 6 months of cafe tips, was gone. Worst of all, my camera equipment had been stolen, including memory cards containing weeks of unedited work. The police took a report but offered little hope of recovery. Insurance was a luxury I didn't have. My housemates, whose expensive electronics had also been taken, at least had parents to call for emergency funds. I sat on my stripped bed after they'd left and faced the reality of my situation. Without a camera, I couldn't complete my coursework. Without a laptop, I couldn't edit or submit assignments. Without my portfolio in progress, I had nothing to show for months of effort. For the first time since leaving home, I considered giving up. Maybe my father had been right. Maybe pursuing art was impractical, foolish, a luxury for people with safety nets I didn't have. I skipped classes the next day, something I'd never done before, and walked to the financial aid office to inquire about the procedure for withdrawing from the program. The same counselor who had helped with my dependency override looked alarmed. "This is very sudden," she said. "You've been doing so well academically. Is there something we can help with before you make this decision?" I explained the situation, hating the tremor in my voice, the weakness I couldn't hide. She listened without interrupting, then asked me to wait while she made a phone call. 20 minutes later, Dr. Levine arrived, slightly out of breath as if she'd rushed across campus. "You're not dropping out," she said flatly, sitting across from me. "We're solving this." What followed was a crash course in the resources I'd been too proud or too unaware to access. The school had an emergency grant program for students in crisis. The art department had loaner equipment available for special circumstances. There was a computer lab with editing software I could use around my work schedule. "Why didn't you come to me immediately?" Dr. Levine asked as we walked to the department office to complete the emergency grant paperwork. "I didn't want special treatment," I admitted. "I didn't want to be a charity case." She stopped walking and faced me directly. "Olivia, using available resources isn't charity. It's strategy. No one succeeds entirely alone. Not me, not the department chair, not the most successful artists in the world. The myth of the solitary genius is just that, a myth." The emergency. Grant covered a basic replacement camera, not as good as what I'd lost, but functional. The loaner program provided access to specialty lenses and lighting equipment when needed. The computer lab became my new studio, where I rebuilt my portfolio from scratch, starting with new shoots to replace what had been stolen. I worked harder than ever, sometimes staying in the lab until it closed at 2 a.m., then opening the cafe at 5 a.m. I stopped taking breaks, stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. My compositions became more urgent, more essential, partly from the pressure of making up lost time, partly from the rawness of emotion I couldn't afford to process. In April, Dr. Levine called me into her office. "You need to slow down," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Your work is strong, but you're not. When was the last time you had a full night's sleep?" I couldn't remember. She pushed a folder across her desk. "A candidate declined the Weber residency. The position is yours if you want it." I stared at the acceptance letter, unable to process what I was reading. 3 months in New York. A stipend that would cover housing and basics. Expenses. Access to equipment I could only dream of. Mentorship from working professionals. "I can't afford to leave my jobs," I said automatically, the instinct for self-preservation overriding opportunity. The stipend is designed to replace income, Dr. Levine explained patiently. That's the point of paid residencies, to give artists time and space to focus on their work. It seemed impossible, too good to be true. What's the catch? No catch, just an opportunity you've earned. She leaned forward. Olivia, you need to learn to accept good things when they come. Not everything is a trap or a trick or a test. That night, I allowed myself to imagine a summer focused solely on photography. No double shifts, no juggling multiple jobs, just creating, learning, growing. It felt like a fantasy, a luxury meant for other people. The next morning, I accepted the residency. May blurred into June. Finals, portfolio reviews, arrangements for the summer. I trained replacements for my campus jobs, promising to return in the fall. I found a subletter for my room in the shared house. I sold everything non-essential to create a small emergency fund that would remain untouched in my account while I was gone. The Weber Gallery sent detailed information about the residency, including profiles of the other participants, all graduate students or early career professionals, all with impressive credentials. Imposter syndrome hit hard as I read their bios. What was I doing in this group? How had I fooled the selection committee into thinking I belonged among them? The night before my departure for New York, Emma visited. We hadn't seen each other in months, both too busy with school and work for more than occasional texts. She brought a going-away gift, a high-capacity external hard drive. For backing up your work, she explained, so you never lose anything important again. We stayed up late, talking about how much had changed since that rainy morning when I'd stood on her porch with everything I owned in 2 bags. Have you heard from them at all? She asked carefully. Your parents? I shook my head. Radio. Silence. Do they know about the residency? About how well you're doing? I have no idea what they know or don't know, I said. I sent my mother some of my work once. She never responded. Emma looked troubled. They're missing out on knowing an amazing person. Their choice, I said with a shrug that didn't quite disguise the lingering pain. I'm building something they can't take away. The Weber residency transformed everything. New York was overwhelming at first. The pace, the noise, the sheer density of humanity. My allocated housing was a small room in a shared apartment with 2 other residents. But compared to my situation at school, it felt luxurious. I had a desk with a window overlooking a busy street, a bed that didn't sag in the middle, and neighbors who actually washed their dishes. The gallery provided studio space in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, equipment that made me dizzy with possibility and weekly critiques with working photographers whose names I'd previously only seen in magazines and books. The other residents welcomed me without the condescension I'd feared, genuinely interested in my night shift series and my perspective as a younger artist. For the first time, I could focus entirely on creating. I explored the city obsessively, photographing in all 5 boroughs at all hours. My project evolved from documenting student workers to capturing a broader spectrum of hidden labor, the people who kept the city functioning while others slept. Kitchen workers emerging from restaurants at dawn, maintenance crews in empty office buildings at midnight, delivery people navigating potholed streets on bicycles. My mentor, Carmen Rodriguez, a documentary photographer known for long-term projects on immigration and labor, pushed me to go deeper with each subject. Don't just show us what they do, she insisted. Show us who they are when they're doing it. The dignity, the fatigue, the pride, the resentment, all of it. Under her guidance, I began interviewing my subjects, recording their stories, adding text elements to the visual presentations. The work became richer, more nuanced, more human. Midway through the residency, the gallery hosted an open studio night where the public could view works in progress. I displayed a series of large-format portraits accompanied by short narrative, texts, intimate glimpses into the lives behind the labor. a construction worker who wrote poetry on his lunch break, a hotel housekeeper studying for medical school entrance exams between shifts, a subway maintenance worker who had been a renowned surgeon in his home country. The response was overwhelming. Visitors lingered at my display, reading every word, studying each image. A small crowd gathered for my artist talk, where I explained my process and motivation. Afterward, people approached with questions, comments, business cards. Among them was Julian Mercer, editor of The Lens, a respected photography magazine with international distribution. "Your work has something many technically superior photographers lack," he said, studying my portraits. "Empathy without exploitation, intimacy without intrusion." He handed me his card. "I'd like to feature this series when it's complete. Call me in August." I floated back to my housing that night, his card clutched in my hand like a talisman. Not just publication, but recognition in a magazine I'd been reading since high school, smuggling issues into my bedroom and studying them, by flashlight after my parents thought I was asleep. The final month of the residency passed in a creative blur. I refined my series, now titled Night Economies, into a cohesive body of work. I expanded my technical skills through workshops with visiting artists. I built connections with fellow residents and gallery staff that felt like the beginning of a professional network, something I'd never imagined having. When August arrived, I called Julian Mercer. 2 weeks later, he visited the gallery to review my completed project. He spent nearly 2 hours examining the prints, reading the accompanying texts, asking questions about my process and intent. "We'll need a bio," he said finally, "and an artist statement. I want to run this in the October issue. 6 pages, with a cover consideration." I stood very still, afraid to breathe. "The cover?" "No promises, but we're discussing it. Your work has a timeliness we look for in cover features." He closed his notebook. "There's a paid fellowship at our sister publication opening next spring. Part-time, but good experience. I've mentioned your name to the program director." After he left, I sat alone in the studio, surrounded by my work, overcome by a feeling I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't quite happiness or pride, though those were elements. It was something deeper, more fundamental, validation, not just from others but from myself. I had taken the biggest risk of my life, walking away from security and family with nothing but a camera and determination. I had nearly failed countless times. I had doubted and struggled and sometimes despaired, but I had never quit. And now, piece by piece, I was building something meaningful, something that belonged entirely to me, that no one could take away or diminish. I took a photograph of myself that evening, the only self-portrait I'd ever created, just my reflection. In the studio window, the city lights blurred behind me, my camera visible in the glass, not for publication or exhibition, but as a private marker of this moment of becoming. The next day, I called Dr. Levine to share the news about the lens feature. Her pleasure was palpable even through the phone. "I knew it," she said simply. "From the first portfolio review, I knew you had something special. Not just talent. Plenty of students have talent, but resilience. The willingness to fall and get up, again and again." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "After the break-in, I nearly quit." "But you didn't," she reminded me. "Remember that the next time things get hard, you've proven you can survive the worst-case scenario." As the residency ended, I faced a decision about returning to Chicago. The fall semester would begin in 2 weeks. My campus jobs were waiting. My sublet was ending. The logical choice was to go back, complete my degree, build on the momentum of the summer. Then Julian Mercer called. The Lens had decided to feature my work on the October cover after all. Additionally, the fellowship he'd mentioned had an opening immediately due to an unexpected departure. It was part-time, paid, and could work around my class schedule if I were in New York. "You'd need to transfer schools," he acknowledged. but I've spoken with people at NYU and Parsons. With a portfolio like yours and the residency on your resume, scholarships might be available. Think about it." I called Dr. Levine again, feeling disloyal, even considering a transfer. "You should absolutely do this," she said without hesitation. "Westridge has given you what we could, but New York will give you what you need next." "But my jobs, my housing, new opportunities, new arrangements," she said firmly. "Olivia, this is how careers are built. You follow the open doors. I'll help with recommendations for the transfer application." 2 frantic weeks followed. I applied for emergency admission to both NYU and Parsons for the fall semester. I interviewed for the fellowship position at the Lens. I searched for affordable housing in New York, an almost impossible task, and found a tiny converted storage room in a shared Brooklyn apartment that I could just afford with my fellowship stipend. 3 days before Westridge classes resumed, I received conditional acceptance to Parsons with a half-tuition scholarship, pending credit transfer approval. The same day, the Lens confirmed my fellowship position. I called the housing office at Westridge to cancel my fall housing, my campus employers to resign my positions, and my sublet to arrange shipping for the few possessions I'd left behind. I felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified, leaping without a safety net yet, again, but this time toward an opportunity rather than away from rejection. The night before fall classes began at Parsons, I stood in my tiny new room, barely large enough for a twin bed and a desk, and unpacked the advance copy of The Lens that had arrived by courier. There it was, my photograph on the cover. A night. Shift worker emerging from the subway at dawn, face illuminated by the first light of day, exhaustion and dignity in equal measure on his features. Inside, a 6-page spread titled "Night Economies: The Invisible Workers of New York," with my images, my words, my vision. I ran my fingers over the glossy pages, overcome by a sense of arrival, not at a destination, but at a beginning. I had survived. I had created. I had been seen. And somewhere in Chicago, I wondered if my parents would happen across this magazine, see my name, and realize what they had thrown away. But for the first time, the thought held no power over me. Their approval or disapproval no longer defined my worth. I had found my voice, and it was finally, unmistakably, my own. New York embraced me like a difficult lover, alternately nurturing and punishing, offering extraordinary opportunities alongside crushing challenges. My first semester at Parsons stretched me in ways Westridge never had. The curriculum was more rigorous, the critiques more brutal, the competition fiercer. Students arrived with polished portfolios and industry connections I could only dream of, casually mentioning summer internships at prestigious magazines or galleries as if everyone had such advantages. For weeks, I struggled with imposter syndrome, certain that my acceptance had been a mistake, that any moment someone would discover I didn't belong and send me back to the Midwest. I worked obsessively, afraid to reveal any weakness or limitation. When classmates discussed expensive equipment or software, I nodded knowingly while taking mental notes to research these tools later in the library. My fellowship at the Lens became my sanctuary. 3 days a week, I assisted with image selection, wrote photo captions, organized the digital archive, and occasionally contributed to the magazine's increasingly popular website. The staff treated me with a respect I wasn't accustomed to, valuing my perspective and including me in editorial discussions despite my junior status. Julian Mercer became an unexpected mentor. Unlike the formally structured mentorship at the Weber residency, this relationship evolved organically through daily interactions and casual conversations over coffee between meetings. "Your instincts for narrative are exceptional," he told me after I'd suggested a compelling sequence for a photo essay on climate refugees. "But you need to build your technical knowledge to match, study the mechanics of publishing, learn the business side." He began assigning me industry reading, books, on media economics, digital publishing strategies, copyright law for visual artists. One afternoon, he casually mentioned that the magazine's accounting department needed help organizing receipts for an audit. "You might find it educational," he suggested. "Understanding how money flows through a publication is valuable knowledge." I spent a weekend sorting expense reports and invoice records, gradually piecing together the complex financial reality behind the glossy magazine pages. The experience was revelatory. I learned more about the practical realities of the industry in those 2 days than in an entire semester of classes. When I thanked Julian for the opportunity, he looked amused. Most fellows would have considered that a punishment assignment. "You're the first to treat it as education." "Where I come from, knowledge is never punishment," I replied. He studied me thoughtfully. "You're not like the others who've come through this fellowship. They're hungry for bylines and connections. You're hungry for understanding. I can't afford to waste opportunities." "No," he agreed. "I don't imagine you can." October brought the official release of my cover story. The response exceeded everyone's expectations. Letters and emails poured in from readers moved by the portraits and stories of night workers. The online version went viral, shared by labor activists, photography enthusiasts, and social justice organizations. 3 gallery owners contacted The Lens requesting my information. A prominent labor organization asked permission to use the images in their advocacy materials. As my work found an audience, my finances remained precarious. The half-tuition scholarship at Parsons covered only a portion of my expenses, and York's cost of living drained my modest fellowship stipend. My converted storage room leaked when it rained. The shared kitchen was perpetually filthy, and the hour-long subway commute to campus consumed precious time I couldn't afford to lose. When winter arrived with bitter cold that seeped through poorly insulated walls, I developed a hacking cough that wouldn't subside. Medical care wasn't an option. I had no insurance and no spare money for clinic visits. I treated myself with over-the-counter medicines and pushed through, attending classes and fellowship duties regardless of how I felt. One particularly brutal December day, Julian found me huddled in the magazine's break room, shivering despite multiple layers and clutching a cup of tea with trembling hands. "How long have you been sick?" he demanded. "It's just a cold," I insisted, my voice hoarse. He frowned. "You need to see a doctor." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're exhausted and ill." His expression softened slightly. "You can't produce your best work if you're running yourself into the ground." The next day, he handed me an envelope. Inside was information about the magazine's freelancer health plan, which provided basic coverage for regular contributors at a reduced group rate. "You qualify," he said simply. "The paperwork's already processed." I stared at him, speechless with gratitude and uncomfortable with the help in equal measure. He seemed to understand the conflict without my expressing it. "This isn't charity," he clarified. "It's an investment in a contributor we value. Take it, see a doctor, and get better." The minor medical coverage allowed me to visit a clinic where I was diagnosed with bronchitis, verging on pneumonia. The prescribed antibiotics and enforced rest period, Julian banned me from the office for 3 days, allowed my body to finally heal. During those quiet days in my tiny room, wrapped in blankets and catching up on editing work I could do remotely, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in my life. For the first time since leaving my parents' home, people in positions of authority were investing in my success rather than throwing obstacles in my path. They weren't simply allowing me to prove myself despite disadvantages. They were actively working to level the playing field. I wasn't naive enough to think this meant the world had suddenly become fair, but I was beginning to understand that, while some doors would always remain closed to me without family connections or financial backing, other doors could open through the recognition of my work and the interventions of people who valued what I could contribute. When I returned to the office, I approached Julian with a carefully considered question. "Why me?" I asked. "You must see dozens of promising photographers. What made you decide to help me specifically?" He considered this while refilling his coffee mug. "Two reasons. First, your work has a rare authenticity. You photograph working people without romanticizing or exploiting them. That perspective is valuable in an industry that tends toward voyeurism." He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Second, you remind me of myself at your age. No connections, no safety net, just talent and determination. Someone gave me a chance once. I'm simply paying it forward." As my first year in New York drew to a close, my life had assumed a new pattern. Classes at Parsons, where I was no longer intimidated by my more privileged peers. Fellowship work at the Lens, where I was increasingly trusted with substantive responsibilities. Freelance photography assignments that came through contacts I'd made from the magazine publication. A new apartment share in Bushwick with two other artists that, while still cramped and occasionally chaotic, didn't leak or freeze. I was building something substantial, not just a portfolio or a resume, but a reputation. My name was becoming known in certain circles, not as a student or an assistant, but as a photographer with a distinctive voice and approach. Gallery owners responded to my emails. Photo editors returned my calls. My work appeared in group shows, online publications, and even a small exhibition at a Brooklyn coffee shop that sold out every print I displayed. During spring break of my junior year, I received an unexpected opportunity. The Lens was sending a team to Detroit to document the aftermath of an economic revitalization project that had displaced long-established communities. Julian wanted me to join as a junior photographer, working alongside their senior documentary photographer, but also producing my own separate body of work. "It's a one-week assignment," he explained. "All expenses covered, plus a day rate that's fair for your experience level." It would be my first assignment outside New York, my first time working as part of a professional team, my first chance to prove I could handle the logistics and pressures of documentary work in an unfamiliar environment. I approached the project with meticulous preparation, researching Detroit's economic history, identifying community organizations I could contact, studying maps and public transportation options. I created shot lists, backup plans for weather contingencies, and detailed schedules to maximize our limited time. The senior photographer, Marcus Chen, seemed amused by my extensive preparation. "You know, most of this will go out the window. Once we're on the ground, right?" he observed as we flew to Detroit. "Documentary work is about adapting to what you find, not controlling it." He was right, of course. Our carefully crafted schedule collapsed within hours of arrival as we discovered communities and situations we hadn't anticipated. A planned, one-hour interview with a neighborhood organizer turned into a day-long tour of affected areas. A morning set aside for photographing abandoned industrial sites evolved into an impromptu portrait session with former factory workers who still gathered at a nearby diner. I learned to follow Marcus's lead, watching how he built rapport with subjects, how he waited patiently for the right moment rather than forcing shots, how he balanced journalistic distance with human connection. At night, reviewing the day's images in our hotel rooms, he offered honest critiques that pushed me to go deeper, to find the emotional core beneath the visual surface. "You're technically proficient," he noted, studying my images from our third day. "But you're still sometimes keeping your subjects at arm's length. You're afraid of intruding, which is better than being exploitative, but it can result in images that feel observed rather than experienced." The next day, I forced myself to get closer, physically and emotionally, to the people we photographed. I asked more personal questions. I shared my own story when appropriate. I let myself be vulnerable, in ways that invited reciprocal openness. The resulting images were markedly different. A series of portraits of elderly residents fighting eviction captured not just their situation, but their dignity, determination, and deep connection to homes they had occupied for decades. Their faces revealed histories that transcended the immediate. Circumstances, speaking to broader themes of belonging, displacement, and resistance. When we returned to New York, Julian reviewed both Marcus's work and mine with careful attention. "These," he said, separating a set of my images from the others, "tell a different story than what we expected. There's something here about resilience and community bonds that's particularly compelling." The magazine ultimately ran a 12-page feature combining work from both photographers, with 3 of my images given full-page treatment. The online version included an additional photo essay composed entirely of my portraits of the elderly residents, accompanied by excerpts from their oral histories that I had recorded during our conversations. The response to the Detroit project exceeded even the reaction to my Night Economies series. I received emails from documentary photographers I had studied in class, praising the sensitivity and depth of the work. A Detroit community organization requested permission to use the images in their advocacy campaigns. A small museum focused on urban history reached out about including several photographs in an upcoming exhibition. Most importantly, Julian and the editorial team began treating me as a photographer first and a fellow second. I was invited to pitch story ideas during editorial meetings. My technical suggestions about image reproduction were taken seriously. My byline appeared on the contributor page with no qualifying terms like student or emerging. As my professional life flourished, I maintained absolute silence with my family. They existed in my mind as a cautionary tale, a reminder of conditional love and the danger of seeking validation from those who fundamentally misunderstood my purpose. I never searched for them online, never drove past the old neighborhood when assignments took me to Chicago, never inquired about them through mutual connections. But occasionally they appeared in my dreams, not as the controlling, dismissive figures who had rejected me, but as shadowy presences just beyond my field of vision, watching from a distance as I built a life they couldn't comprehend. I would wake from these dreams with a lingering sadness not for what I had lost, but for what they had never allowed themselves to see. The summer before my senior year, Julian called me into his office for what I assumed would be a discussion about upcoming assignments. "I've received an interesting inquiry," he said, tapping a folder on his desk. "The Hoffman Foundation is launching a major photographic project on changing labor conditions across America. 3 photographers, 18 months, full funding, complete creative freedom. The resulting work will be published as a book, exhibited in major cities, and archived in the Library of Congress." My pulse quickened. The Hoffman Foundation was legendary in documentary circles for their long-term, in-depth projects that often defined visual understanding of significant social issues. "They've asked me to recommend photographers," Julian continued. "I've put your name forward for consideration." I stared at him, momentarily speechless. "I haven't even graduated yet." "They're looking for distinct perspectives and approaches, not academic credentials. Your work on Night Economies and the Detroit Project demonstrates exactly the kind of humanistic documentation they want." "Who are the other photographers you're recommending?" "Marcus Chen and Eliza Terrence." I knew both names well, established photographers with decades of experience and multiple books to their credit. The idea of being considered alongside them seemed absurd. "This would mean taking a leave from school," Julian acknowledged, "but Parsons would almost certainly allow it, especially given the prestige of the project. You could complete your degree afterward." "If I'm even selected," I said, still processing the magnitude of the opportunity. "You should prepare as if you will be," he advised. "They'll want to see a proposal, your specific vision for approaching the project, methodology, areas of focus. It needs to be substantive, but also distinct from what the other photographers might offer." Over the next 2 weeks, I immersed myself in research about labor conditions across different regions and industries. I studied previous Hoffman Foundation projects to understand their scope and approach. I drafted and redrafted a proposal focusing on invisible labor systems, the support structures and service work that enabled more recognized forms of productivity. My vision expanded beyond my earlier work documenting night shift workers to encompass a broader examination of how labor was valued, compensated, and recognized in contemporary America. I proposed dividing my time between rural agricultural communities, suburban service economies, and urban care networks, examining how gender, race, immigration status, and geography influenced the conditions and recognition of essential work. When I submitted the proposal to Julian for review, he read it in silence, expression unreadable. "This is ambitious," he said finally. "Too ambitious?" I asked, suddenly uncertain. "Necessarily ambitious," he clarified. "This kind of opportunity demands nothing less." He made a few notations on the margin of the document. "Strengthen the methodology section. Be more specific about how you'll gain access to these communities. Otherwise, it's exceptional." The revised proposal went to the Hoffman Foundation in early July. I was told decisions would be made by September, in time for the project to begin in January of the following year. I returned to my classes and fellowship duties, trying not to fixate on the possibility that seemed simultaneously within reach and wildly improbable. In mid-August, I received an email requesting a virtual interview with the Foundation's selection committee. Julian helped me prepare, conducting mock interviews and challenging me with difficult questions about my experience, approach, and ability to handle the logistical challenges of extended field work. The actual interview lasted nearly 2 hours. 5 committee members asked detailed questions about my proposal, my previous work, and my personal connection to labor issues. I spoke candidly about my own experiences working multiple jobs while pursuing education, about the dignity I had witnessed in people performing essential but undervalued work, about my commitment to creating images that revealed rather than exploited the subjects. "Your proposal differs from the others we're considering," noted the committee chair near the end of the interview. "Most applicants focus on the decline of traditional industries or the exploitation within specific sectors. You're proposing something more systemic, an examination of how essential labor is rendered invisible by social and economic structures." "That invisibility is by design," I replied. "It serves power structures when necessary. Work remains unseen, and therefore undervalued. My goal is to make that work, and those workers, visible in ways that cannot be dismissed." After the interview, weeks passed with no word. I began my senior year at Parsons, registered for classes, and resumed my regular schedule at the Lens. Julian advised patience, explaining that foundation decisions often moved slowly through multiple approval levels. In late September, I was photographing a labor rally in Union Square when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail, focusing on capturing the energy of the crowd and the passionate expressions of the speakers. When I checked the message later that evening, my hands began to shake. It was Eleanor Hoffman herself, chair of the foundation, asking me to call her back at my earliest convenience. I paced my apartment for 20 minutes, gathering my courage before returning the call. She answered on the second ring. "Ms. Reeves, thank you for getting back to me so promptly. I'm calling with good news. The selection committee was deeply impressed by your proposal and interview. We would like to offer you one of the 3 photographer positions for our American Labor Project." The words washed over me like a wave, momentarily robbing me of speech. When I finally responded, my voice sounded distant to my own ears. "I'm honored," I managed. "Thank you for this opportunity." "Your perspective brings something unique to the project," she continued. "The committee was particularly moved by your personal connection to the subject matter and your demonstrated ability to capture the dignity of working people without sentimentality or exploitation." We discussed next steps, Contracts to be signed, budgets to be approved, logistics to be arranged. The foundation would provide equipment, travel expenses, a living stipend, and health insurance for the duration of the project. I would retain copyright of my images while granting the foundation exhibition and publication rights. This is a significant undertaking for someone at your career stage, Eleanor acknowledged near the end of our conversation. But we believe you're ready. Your work shows a maturity beyond your years. After we hung up, I sat motionless on my bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. This wasn't simply a professional opportunity, it was validation, on a scale I had never allowed myself to imagine. 3 years after being told I would never succeed, that my dreams were impractical and my aspirations foolish, I had been selected for one of the most prestigious documentary projects in the country. I called Julian first, my voice breaking as I shared the news. His response was uncharacteristically emotional. "I knew it," he said, pride evident in his tone. "From the moment I saw your work, I knew you had this in you." "I wouldn't be here without your support," I acknowledged. "No," he corrected gently. "You wouldn't be here now. But you would have gotten here eventually, on your own terms. I just accelerated the inevitable." That night, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself a rare moment of celebration. I ordered takeout from a restaurant I normally couldn't afford, opened a bottle of wine Emma had sent when the Detroit project was published, and sat by my window overlooking the Brooklyn streets that had become home. For the first time in years, I found myself thinking not about survival or proving myself, but about the responsibility that came with this opportunity. I had been given a platform to tell stories that mattered, to make visible the people and work that society often rendered invisible. The validation was gratifying, but the purpose was what truly moved me. As January approached, I finalized arrangements for my leave of absence from Parsons and my transition away from regular duties at the Lens. Julian arranged for me to maintain a contributing editor role, occasionally submitting pieces from my travels when they aligned with the magazine's editorial calendar. The week before the project officially began, an orientation session brought together the 3 selected photographers, foundation staff, and project advisors at the Hoffman offices. In Manhattan, meeting Marcus Chen again, this time as a colleague rather than a mentor, and being introduced to Eliza Terrence, whose books had occupied places of honor on my shelves, was surreal. "I've followed your night economy's work," Eliza said during a break. "It's remarkable. Fresh perspective, genuine empathy without becoming sentimental. The foundation made an excellent choice." Coming from a photographer whose decades-long documentation of rural American life had influenced countless younger artists, the compliment was momentarily overwhelming. "Your work on agricultural communities inspired parts of my proposal," I admitted, "especially your approach to building relationships before bringing out the camera." She smiled. "The technical aspects of photography are learnable. The human connections, knowing when to observe and when to engage, how to be present without becoming intrusive, that's the art. You have that instinct naturally." The project schedule was finalized during those meetings. I would begin in the Pacific Northwest, documenting seasonal agricultural workers, then move south through California's service economy before heading east to explore care work in the Southwest. Later segments would take me through the Midwest, Appalachia, and eventually the Northeast Industrial Corridor. As we reviewed maps and timelines, I realized I would be passing through Chicago in the fall, exactly 10 years after I had been forced to leave. The coincidence seemed meaningful, though I wasn't yet sure how or why. The night before my flight to Seattle to begin the project, I sat in my mostly packed apartment reviewing equipment checklists and contact information for my first subjects. My phone rang with an unknown Chicago area code. Thinking it might be a potential subject from later in the project, I answered professionally, "Olivia Reeves speaking." There was a pause, then a voice I hadn't heard in nearly a decade. "Olivia, it's your mother." The world seemed to still around me. The familiar voice, older, hesitant, but unmistakable, connected past, and present in a way that left me momentarily disoriented. "How did you get this number?" I finally asked, my own voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. "Through a colleague who subscribes to The Lens," she replied. "I saw your name on the cover last year. I've been following your work since then." Another pause. "You've done very well for yourself." The understatement was almost laughable. I said nothing, waiting. "I'm calling because..." She hesitated. "Your father's accounting firm has failed. The partnership dissolved after some financial irregularities were discovered. Not fraud exactly, but serious enough that clients left in droves. I processed this information with surprising detachment. "I'm sorry to hear that." "We've had to sell the house," she continued. "We're living in a condo now. Things are difficult." I waited for more, sensing this wasn't simply an update on family circumstances. "Your father would never admit it, but he needs help," she finally said. "His reputation in financial circles is damaged. His client base is gone. Her voice broke slightly. "He's not handling it well." The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had thrown me out for choosing an impractical career path was now facing the collapse of his supposedly stable profession. "What exactly are you asking, Mom?" She took a deep breath. "We've heard about this project you're doing. The foundation thing. It sounds prestigious." "It is. Your father has expertise in financial management for small businesses. He could consult, advise business owners you photograph, rebuild his client base." I nearly laughed out loud at the audacity. "You want me to use a documentary project on exploited workers to help Dad find accounting clients?" "Not like that," she protested weakly. "He could offer valuable services, help people. The same way you both helped me?" The words escaped before I could moderate them. "By throwing me out? By cutting me off completely? By never once reaching out until you needed something?" Silence stretched between us. Then, in a smaller voice, "We made a mistake. 10 years of absence, of struggle, of building myself from nothing, reduced to a mistake." "I have to go," I said finally. "I'm leaving for a project in the morning." "Olivia, please." He would never ask himself, but things are desperate. "Maybe when you're in Chicago this fall we could meet? Talk about possibilities?" I felt a surge of something between anger and pity. "How do you know I'll be in Chicago?" "The project website. It lists the general schedule." A pause. "I've been following everything about your career. Everything I could find." The admission was startling. The image of my mother secretly tracking my professional development, perhaps keeping clippings or bookmarking articles, while maintaining the silence that had defined our relationship for a decade. "I'll be documenting labor conditions," I said finally. "Not networking for an accountant who couldn't adapt to changing markets. Please don't contact me again." I ended the call and sat in the stillness of my apartment, waiting for the emotions to hit. Anger, vindication, perhaps even satisfaction at their reversal of fortune. Instead, I felt a profound emptiness, as if the final thread connecting me to my former life had been severed. The phone rang again, same number. I let it go to voicemail, then again, and again. Finally, I turned off my phone, finished packing my equipment, and prepared for tomorrow's journey. Whatever they needed, whatever they wanted, it belonged to a past I had outgrown. My future, captured in the plane ticket on my desk, the camera equipment carefully packed, the project documentation neatly organized, awaited. It was built on my terms, through my work, by my own hands. And no one, not even the people who had once defined my world, could diminish what I had created from nothing but determination and an unwavering belief in my own vision. The morning I joined a gathering of workers outside O'Hare International, the Chicago wind cut through my jacket like it was determined to remind me where I was. I'd avoided this city for years, but now, 10 years after being thrown out, I was back on assignment. Not as the desperate teenager my parents had dismissed, but as Olivia Reeves, the documentary photographer whose work now appeared in major publications and museums. My camera captured the pre-dawn ritual of airport service workers arriving for their shifts. The security guards, baggage handlers, food service staff, and cleaning crews who kept one of the world's busiest airports functioning. They arrived on night buses, in carpools, and from nearby budget motels where many stayed between split shifts. Their faces showed the particular fatigue of those who work while others sleep, who prepare spaces that others will pass through without noticing, who maintain them. "They call us unskilled," said Marcus, a baggage handler who had allowed me to shadow him for the day. 23 years I've been doing this job. I can tell you the weight distribution needed for every aircraft in this airport. I can spot a problem bag before it jams the whole system. But on paper, I'm just a guy who moves things from one place to another. I photographed his hands, strong, weathered, precisely placing luggage on the conveyor system with a speed and accuracy that made the complex task look effortless. These were the hands of an expert, their movements refined through thousands of repetitions into something approaching artistry. My camera caught what most passengers never saw, the intelligence and skill embodied in work dismissed as menial. This was the heart of my project for the Hoffman Foundation, an 18-month documentation of labor across America, revealing the full humanity of those whose work sustained our economy, but whose contributions remained largely invisible. The Chicago portion would focus on service infrastructure, the intersecting networks of labor that maintained the city's status as a global business hub. After the airport, I moved to document hotel workers preparing luxury accommodations downtown. I arrived at 4:30 a.m. to capture the rhythms of the morning shift, the precise choreography of housekeepers, maintenance staff, kitchen workers, and concierges, transforming spaces from their nighttime utility state back into theaters of seamless comfort before guests awoke. In the massive hotel laundry facility, I photographed workers processing mountains of linens, sorting, washing, pressing, and folding at industrial scale. The heat was oppressive, the noise constant. Maria, the supervisor who had granted me access, pointed to a young woman operating a pressing machine with remarkable speed. "Jeanette does the work of 2 people," she explained. "She's supporting 3 children and her mother. The guests sleeping on the sheets she presses will never know her name or recognize her if they passed her on the street." I created a series of diptychs pairing images of pristine hotel suites with the industrial spaces where their essential elements were maintained. An immaculate bathroom alongside the steaming laundry room where towels were processed, a perfectly prepared meeting room next to the underground storage area where furniture was meticulously maintained and repaired. Throughout the first week, I kept my connection to Chicago carefully compartmentalized. This was not my hometown anymore, but simply another location for the project. A place to document and understand, not to revisit personal history. I stayed in a foundation-arranged hotel downtown, far from the northern suburbs where I had grown up, and focused entirely on the work. But Chicago had other plans. 7 days into my assignment, as I was photographing early morning retail workers, preparing Michigan Avenue boutiques before opening, my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown local number. "We know you're in Chicago. Please consider meeting with us. It would mean everything." The message lacked a signature, but I recognized my mother's phrasing immediately. She had been tracking my movements through the project's public website, waiting for my arrival in the city. I deleted the message without responding and continued. documenting the retail workers transforming luxury storefronts from after-hours workspaces back into pristine shopping environments, steaming designer garments, meticulously arranging displays, polishing surfaces to mirror finishes. The following day brought another text. Your father is too proud to ask directly, but we need to talk. Things have gotten worse. Then, a few hours later, the accounting firm is completely gone. The legal issues have escalated. Please, Olivia. I continued to ignore these messages, but their content lingered as I photographed legal support staff, the paralegals, administrative assistants, and document specialists whose labor made possible the high-priced work of attorneys in the city's prestigious firms. The parallels to my father's situation were unavoidable. The precarity that existed even in supposedly secure professional fields, the swift fall from established success to desperate uncertainty. On my 10th day in Chicago, I was setting up to photograph the morning shift change at a downtown hotel when I sensed someone watching me. Turning from my equipment, I found myself face to face with my mother for the first time in a decade. She looked simultaneously familiar and foreign, her hair now completely gray, her face lined in ways I didn't recognize, her posture less rigid than I remembered. She wore a simple wool coat, lacking the designer labels that had once defined her wardrobe, no jewelry visible at her neck or wrists. "Olivia," she said softly, her voice uncertain. I maintained my professional composure despite the internal turmoil her presence triggered. "I'm working right now." "I know. I've been following your schedule on the project website." She glanced at my camera equipment. I wouldn't interrupt if it weren't important. I continued setting up my tripod, focusing on the mechanical task to steady myself. "I've made it clear I don't want contact." "Your father has been indicted," she said bluntly. "Conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The firm's senior partner was running a scheme. Your father claims he didn't know, but the evidence suggests otherwise." This information penetrated my carefully constructed emotional barrier. I stopped adjusting the camera and looked directly at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he's facing prison time, because everything we had is gone. The house, the savings, the retirement accounts. Because I'm filing for divorce after 40 years of marriage." The words tumbled out with an emotional rawness I'd never heard from her. "Because I finally understand what it means to have the life you thought you were building collapse completely." The parallel to my own experience was too pointed to be coincidental. "So you're drawing a comparison between your current situation and what you both did to me?" "No," she said quickly. "What we did to you was worse. We chose to reject you. You didn't do anything wrong except want a different life than we had planned." She looked down at her hands, which I noticed were bare of the expensive rings she'd always worn. "I'm not here to ask for money or help with your father's legal problems. That's not why I came." "Then why did you?" "To apologize, properly, without asking for anything in return." She met my gaze directly. "And to tell you, I've been following your career for years, that I've kept every magazine with your work, every newspaper mention, every online article, that I've been proud of you, silently and uselessly while lacking the courage to tell you." I said nothing, processing this unexpected declaration while maintaining my external composure. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued when I remained silent. "I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your father's collapse has forced me to reevaluate everything, including the terrible mistake we made with you." A group of hotel workers began gathering nearby, preparing for the shift change I was there to document. My professional responsibilities provided a welcome reason to end this unexpected encounter. "I need to work now," I said, gesturing to the 8 assembling group. She nodded, understanding the dismissal. "I've left a letter for you at your hotel. It includes my contact information if you ever want it." She hesitated, then added, "What you've built is extraordinary, Olivia. I was wrong not to see the potential of your vision." As she walked away, I forced myself to refocus on the assignment, directing my attention to the hotel workers rather than my retreating mother. I conducted the photo session with professional detachment, documenting the precise choreography of the shift change, the exchange of information between departing and arriving staff, the handover of keys and equipment, the brief social interactions that humanized an otherwise transactional process. Only later, reviewing the images in my hotel room, did I notice how my emotional state had influenced my compositional choices. The frames tighter than usual, the perspectives slightly askew, the focus on hands and gestures rather than faces. The images were compelling, but revealed an emotional undertone atypical of my usual controlled approach. The front desk had indeed delivered a sealed envelope to my room. It sat unopened on the desk as I worked, its presence impossible to ignore, completely but deliberately set aside as I processed the day's photographs and prepared for the next day's shoot. After completing my work, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter several pages long, covering both sides of each sheet in my mother's precise handwriting. It began with a comprehensive apology, not just for the rejection, a decade earlier, but for the years of conditional love that had preceded it, the rigid expectations that had prioritized appearances over authentic connection, the failure to see and value me as an individual rather than an extension of my parents' ambitions. The letter continued with a detailed account of my father's downfall, not seeking sympathy but offering context for her own awakening. The prestigious accounting firm had been engaged in fraudulent practices for years, manipulating financial statements for wealthy clients seeking to avoid tax obligations. As investigators closed in, the senior partners had attempted to shield themselves by implicating junior partners like my father in the scheme. "Your father believed that following rules and maintaining appearances was the path to security," she wrote. "The irony is that this rigid adherence to what he thought was expected of him, never questioning, never challenging, always complying with what those above him demanded, led to his destruction. He faces prison because he couldn't imagine stepping outside the path laid for him." The parallel to what they had tried to impose on me was unmistakable. The final pages detailed her own transformation, leaving the social circles that had defined her identity, finding part-time work as an administrative assistant at a community college, learning to live with financial constraints she had never imagined facing. She described the humbling process of rebuilding a life without the material advantages and social position she had previously taken for granted. "I understand now what you faced when we cut you off," she concluded. "The terror of starting over without resources or support. The necessity of redefining yourself beyond the identities others have assigned to you. I'm only beginning this journey at 63. You conquered it at 18, with a courage I'm only now beginning to comprehend." The letter ended with her new contact information, a Gmail address rather than the personalized domain they had previously used, a phone number with an unfamiliar area code, an address for a small apartment in a neighborhood I knew was modest by Chicago standards. "I expect nothing," she wrote in closing. "But if someday you wish to know more about how your mother is remaking herself in your image, finding independence and purpose beyond the narrow role I accepted for decades, I would welcome the chance to learn from your example." I set the letter aside and turned to my window, looking out at the Chicago skyline illuminated against the night sky. The city that had once represented constraint now appeared different, not because it had fundamentally changed, but because I had transcended its limitations, built a life and career beyond what anyone here had imagined possible for me, returned not as a supplicant, but as a successful professional doing important work. Sleep proved elusive that night. I found myself reviewing the last decade, the desperate early days after being thrown out, the endless work hours, the gradual building of skills and reputation, the breakthroughs that had transformed me from surviving to thriving. Throughout that journey, I had maintained the wound of rejection as a kind of fuel, converting pain into determination. What would it mean to let that go? What would motivate me if not the need to prove my parents wrong? The next morning, I rose early and immersed myself in work, documenting hospital night shift workers, the custodial staff, laboratory technicians, security personnel, and administrative workers who kept medical facilities functioning during hours when most patients were asleep and physicians absent. Their labor occurred in a liminal space, essential but largely unseen, maintaining systems that others would use without acknowledging who had prepared them. As I photographed a lab technician processing urgent blood work at 3 a.m., I found myself thinking about visibility, who gets seen and acknowledged, whose contributions register in our collective consciousness. My mother's letter suggested she had been seeing me all along, tracking my career while maintaining silence, proud but unable to bridge the gap her own actions had created. The following days brought a particularly intense phase of the project, documenting workers across various sectors from manufacturing to food service to public transportation. I maintained a grueling schedule, starting before dawn to capture morning preparations, and often continuing until midnight to document closing procedures. The work provided welcome distraction from the emotional complexities my mother's reappearance had triggered. A week after our encounter, I received another text. I understand your silence. Just know that I'm finally beginning to understand the courage it took for you to build a life on your own terms. Whatever you decide about contact, I'm proud of what you've created. This message, unlike the earlier ones, seemed to require no response. A statement rather than a plea, an acknowledgement without expectation. I saved it but didn't reply, still uncertain of what I wanted from this unexpected reopening of communication. My Chicago documentation continued, shifting focus to financial services infrastructure. The visible and invisible labor that maintained the gleaming downtown offices where transactions moved global markets. I photographed the pre-dawn cleaning crews preparing spaces for executives' arrival, the food service workers feeding the financial workforce, the maintenance staff ensuring the seamless operation of buildings designed to impress clients and intimidate competitors. I also examined the growing sector of financial technology startups reshaping traditional banking and investment services, workplaces that projected casual egalitarianism while often reproducing traditional hierarchies beneath the surface of open floor plans and free snack bars. At a major financial services firm housed in a downtown skyscraper, I documented the contrast between public-facing areas designed to project stability and prosperity and the windowless back offices where support staff processed paperwork, managed systems, and handled customer service interactions for fractions of the compensation awarded to front office personnel. The resulting images revealed the stratification of financial labor, the visible prestige work performed by those with advanced degrees in social capital, and the essential but invisible maintenance work performed by those without such advantages. The series, which I titled The Architecture of Finance, examined how physical spaces reinforced these distinctions, with design elements subtly communicating who belonged in which spaces and under what conditions. As my Chicago assignment neared its conclusion, I faced a decision about my mother's overture. The professional part of me, the documentary photographer trained to observe without interference, wanted to maintain distance, to treat this as simply another human dynamic, not requiring my participation. But another part recognized the rarity of what was being offered, not reconciliation exactly, but acknowledgement, a recognition of harm done and lessons learned. After considerable reflection, I drafted a brief response. I've received your letter. I need time to process everything. My work requires my full attention right now, but I'll contact you when I'm ready to discuss further. I included no title or closing, neither mom nor my name, just the message itself, delivered without emotional markers. Her reply came hours later. Thank you. I'll be here whenever or if ever you're ready. No pressure, no expectations. The key exchange left me with a strange sense of equilibrium. Neither the sharp pain of rejection nor the uncertain hope of reconciliation, but something in between. A door neither closed nor fully opened, but unlocked and available should I choose to approach it. My final day in Chicago involved documenting transit workers during the evening rush hour, the bus drivers, train operators, station attendants, and maintenance personnel who facilitated the mass movement of people from workplaces back to homes. I focused particularly on the interactions between workers and commuters, capturing the brief moments of human connection amidst the automated procedures and tight schedules. As I photographed a bus driver greeting regular passengers by name, checking on an elderly rider's health, and patiently explaining route changes to confused tourists, I found myself thinking about care work, the emotional labor embedded in ostensibly technical jobs, the human attention that transcended formal job descriptions. That evening, as I packed my equipment for the next phase of the project in the Northeast, I received a final text from my mother. "I saw you today at the Franklin station. Didn't approach because you were working. Just wanted to say how moving. It was to see you in your element, focused, confident, seeing things others miss. Safe travels, Olivia." I hadn't noticed her presence, so absorbed was I in documenting the station workers. The idea that she had observed me at work, seeing the professional I had become without interrupting or inserting herself into the moment, suggested a respect for boundaries I had never experienced from her before. The next morning, as my train pulled out of Union Station, I watched the Chicago skyline recede with mixed emotions. The city was no longer simply the site of rejection and painful beginnings, but had acquired new layers of meaning, a place where I had created important professional work, where unexpected personal renegotiations had begun, where the past had started to transform from active wound to closed chapter. The Foundation Project continued across the Northeast, documenting labor conditions in manufacturing, healthcare, education, and emerging technology sectors. In Boston, I focused on hospital workers across all levels, from surgeons and specialists to the cleaning staff who prevented infections and the food service workers who accommodated complex dietary needs. In New York, I documented the hidden infrastructure of the fashion industry, from pattern makers and sample sewers in Manhattan to warehouse workers in Brooklyn fulfilling online orders. Throughout these final months, I produced some of my strongest work, images that revealed not just labor conditions, but the complex human ecosystems that formed around different types of work. My approach had evolved over the course of the project, becoming more nuanced in its understanding of how dignity manifested in necessary labor, how skill expressed itself in tasks often dismissed as menial, how human connection persisted even in highly automated environments. When the 18-month project reached its conclusion, the resulting body of work was substantial, over 50,000 images, hundreds of recorded interviews, and extensive written documentation of labor practices across regions and industries. The CHI Foundation's editorial team worked with me to select and sequence images for publication, exhibition, and archival purposes, resulting in a comprehensive visual record of American labor in the early 21st century. The book, titled Essential: The Visible and Invisible Labor of American Life, was published to critical acclaim by a prestigious art press. The accompanying exhibition opened at the Museum of Modern Art in New York before traveling to major museums across the country. Critics particularly noted the humanistic approach to subject matter that could easily have been treated with either detached objectivity or heavy-handed advocacy. Reeves's images reveal the dignity inherent in necessary work, wrote the New York Times art critic. She neither romanticizes labor nor reduces workers to their circumstances, instead showing the full humanity of those whose efforts sustain our economic and social systems. At the exhibition opening in New York, surrounded by enlarged prints of images I had created across 18 months of travel and documentation, I experienced a moment of profound recognition, not just of the work's significance, but of my own journey from rejected daughter to established artist whose vision commanded respect and attention. Julian Mercer, my early mentor who had flown in for the opening, found me standing before a wall of images documenting care workers across different settings. "How does it feel?" he asked, gesturing to the crowded gallery where critics, collectors, and foundation representatives discussed my work. "Surreal," I admitted. "I keep thinking of that rainy night when I had nowhere to go, no plan beyond survival." He nodded thoughtfully. "The greatest victory isn't the public recognition, though that matters. It's that you trusted your vision when everyone who should have supported you failed to see its value." As we moved through the exhibition, Eleanor, Hoffman approached with news that further validated this assessment. The foundation had decided to establish a permanent fellowship program for emerging documentary photographers, with a focus on providing opportunities to those from backgrounds typically underrepresented in the field. "We'd like to name it after you," she said, "the Olivia Reeves Fellowship for Documentary Photography. Your story and work exemplify exactly what we hope to nurture in the next generation." The proposal was unexpected and momentarily overwhelming. "I'm still early in my career," I protested. "Fellowships are usually named for established figures, with decades of work behind them." "This isn't about the quantity of your work, but its impact," Eleanor countered. "Your journey from exclusion to recognition, your ability to see dignity in subjects others might overlook. These are qualities we want to identify and support in emerging photographers. The fellowship would provide financial support, mentorship, and exhibition opportunities to early career photographers focusing on social documentation, with preference given to applicants who had overcome significant barriers to pursuing their artistic vision." As I considered the proposal, I thought of how my own path might have been easier with such structured support. How much energy I had expended on basic survival that could have been directed toward creative development. The opportunity to ease that journey for others with similar determination but fewer advantages held profound appeal. "I would be honored," I said finally, "but with one condition. I want to be involved in the selection process, not to control it, but to bring perspective on identifying potential that might not be obvious in conventional portfolio reviews." Eleanor readily agreed, and we outlined a structure for the fellowship program that would launch the following year, creating a sustainable pathway for voices that might otherwise remain unheard in the documentary photography field. That evening, at the private dinner following the exhibition opening, surrounded by colleagues, mentors, and foundation representatives celebrating the project's completion, I felt a momentary disconnect between my present circumstances and the journey that had brought me here. The elegant museum restaurant, the deferential service, the animated discussions of my work's significance all seemed impossibly distant from the teenager standing in the rain with nowhere to go. Yet the connection was direct and undeniable. Every image on the museum walls, every page of the published book, carried the influence of that formative rejection and the subsequent struggle to build something meaningful from its aftermath. My distinctive perspective, the ability to see dignity in necessary labor, to recognize the humanity in those performing essential but undervalued work, had been shaped by my own experiences of invisibility and dismissal. As the evening concluded and guests departed, I remained briefly at the table, sipping the last of my wine and mentally cataloging this milestone moment. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unfamiliar number. "Saw the exhibition mentioned? In today's Tribune. So proud of what you've accomplished. Wishing you continued success." No signature was necessary. The Chicago area code identified my mother as clearly as if she'd signed her name. I hadn't contacted her in the months since our Chicago encounter, but neither had I discarded her letter or forgotten her words. The text seemed carefully calibrated, an acknowledgement without pressure, support without expectation, connection without demand. After a moment's consideration, I typed a simple response. "Thank you. The book is being published next month. I'll have a copy sent to you." It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It wasn't an invitation to reclaim parental status or a promise of regular contact, but it was, perhaps, an acknowledgement that even the most painful rejections could eventually lose their power to define us. That success built on one's own terms rendered old dismissals irrelevant, transforming them from open wounds to closed chapters in a larger, more complex narrative. In the weeks that followed, as I balanced a growing number of exhibition and speaking invitations with planning for new documentary projects, I maintained minimal but consistent contact with my mother. Our exchanges were brief, focused primarily on professional updates rather than emotional terrain, but they represented a tentative bridge across a decade of silence. I learned that my father had accepted a plea deal and was serving a 3-year sentence at a minimum security facility. That my mother had completed a certificate program in office administration and secured a full-time position at the community college where she had started as a part-time assistant. That she was volunteering with a program helping women rebuild financial independence after divorce or widowhood. These details arrived without requests for response or emotional engagement. Simply information shared, history updated, context provided should I ever wish to make use of it. The restraint itself represented a form of respect I had never experienced from her before. When the book was published, I arranged for a signed copy to be sent to her new address. A week later, I received a card containing a single sentence: "You've made visible what most people never see, in your subjects and in yourself." 3 months later, as I was preparing for a new documentary project on immigrant labor in agricultural communities, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity and lack of emotional turmoil. I would stop in Chicago for 2 days between assignments. I would meet my mother for coffee, not at her apartment or in any space with personal history, but in a neutral location where we could speak as two adults with a complicated shared past rather than as parent and child. I sent a brief message proposing the meeting, specifying the limited time frame and public setting. Her response came quickly: "I'll be there. Thank you for this opportunity." On a bright spring morning, almost 11 years after being told I would never amount to anything without family support, I sat across from my mother in a downtown cafe. She looked different from my childhood memories, smaller somehow, less intimidating, her expensive clothes and jewelry replaced by simple, practical attire, her once perfect manicure now short and unpolished. "You look well," she said after we had ordered. "The success suits you." "It's not about the success," I replied. "It's about the work itself, creating something meaningful, something that reflects what I see and value." She nodded, accepting the correction. "I've been thinking a lot about seeing lately, about how I spent decades looking without actually seeing, at you, at my marriage, at the world around me. I was so focused on maintaining appearances that I missed the substance beneath them." "What changed?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Everything falling apart forced me to see what was real," she said simply. "When you lose all the external markers of identity, the house, the social position, the financial security, you discover whether anything solid remains underneath." "And did it? For you?" She considered this carefully. "Not at first. I realized I'd built my entire life around reflecting what others expected or wanted. Your father, our social circle, even you in a different way. I had to start from zero, asking what mattered to me when nobody was watching or judging." The vulnerability in this admission was striking from a woman who had once maintained perfect composure at all costs. I found myself responding not to the mother who had rejected me, but to the person sitting before me now, someone engaged in her own difficult reconstruction. "That's not unlike what I had to do," I acknowledged. "Figure out who I was when everything familiar was gone." "The difference," she said quietly, "is that you were forced into that position by our cruelty. I arrived there through the consequences of choices I participated in or enabled." We talked for nearly 2 hours, covering territory that ranged From her ongoing divorce proceedings to my upcoming projects, from her volunteer work to my teaching opportunities at several prestigious art schools. The conversation wasn't effortless. Silences stretched occasionally when sensitive areas were approached, but it maintained a remarkable steadiness, neither collapsing into recrimination nor evading difficult truths. As our time drew to a close, she placed a small package on the table. "This isn't a gift with expectations," she clarified. "Just something I thought you should have." Inside was a memory card, the type used in digital cameras, labeled with dates from my high school years. "These are photographs you took as a teenager," she explained. "The ones you thought we didn't know about. I found them on the family computer years ago but never said anything. I made this copy before we sold the house, thinking someday you might want them." I stared at the memory card, stunned by both its existence and the revelation that my secret passion hadn't been as hidden as I'd believed. "Why didn't you say anything back then?" I asked. "If you knew I was interested in photography." "Because I was following your father's lead in everything," she admitted. "I lacked the courage to form my own opinions or advocate for your dreams against his plans. It's my deepest regret." I placed the memory card carefully in my bag, unsure how I felt about this unexpected connection to my past self, the tentative early work that had preceded everything I'd built professionally. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said as we prepared to leave, "or even regular contact. I just want you to know that however much I failed as a mother when it mattered most, I see you now. I recognize the extraordinary person and artist you've become, and I'm grateful for this chance to tell you directly." We parted with an awkward, brief hug, our first physical contact in over a decade. No promises were made about future meetings or ongoing communication. No dramatic reconciliation occurred. It was simply a conversation between two adults with a complicated shared history, each acknowledging the other's current reality. That evening, in my hotel room, I inserted the memory card into my laptop and found hundreds of photographs from my teenage years, experimental shots of household objects in dramatic lighting, portraits of neighborhood children playing, urban landscapes captured during school trips. The images were amateurish in technique, but showed clear hints of the visual sensibility I would later develop, an attraction to human moments, an eye for dignity in ordinary circumstances, an interest in the interplay of light and shadow. Looking at these early attempts, I felt a strange tenderness toward my younger self, the girl who had recognized her calling despite lack of support or guidance, who had pursued her vision in secret before finding the courage to claim it openly. Those furtive experiments had contained the seeds of everything I would later build. I selected several of the strongest images and sent them to my professional email, planning to include them in an upcoming lecture on artistic development. The rest I would save, not out of sentimentality, but as documentation of where my journey had begun. The following day, as my flight departed for my next assignment, I looked down at Chicago growing smaller beneath the clouds. The city was no longer defined solely by rejection, but had acquired new meaning. A place where I had created important work, where unexpected personal evolution had occurred, where the past had been partially reframed if not entirely reconciled. My phone contained a brief message sent that morning. "Safe travels. Your early photographs show you already had the eye. I was blind not to see it." I saved the message without responding immediately. There would be time later to determine what form our communication might take going forward, what boundaries would be necessary, what expectations reasonable, what healing possible. For now, it was enough to acknowledge that things had shifted, that rigidity had given way to possibility, that the story was still unfolding. My parents had once insisted I would never amount to anything without their support and guidance. The irony was that their rejection had forced me to discover strengths and talents I might never have recognized had I followed their prescribed path. In throwing me out, They had inadvertently liberated me to become the artist and person I was meant to be. Now, 11 years after that rainy night, I had built something they could neither claim credit for nor diminish with their judgment. A body of work, a professional reputation, and a perspective uniquely my own. Their opinion, once so devastatingly definitive, had become merely one element in a life defined by my own vision, choices, and determination. The new documentary project awaited, with its own challenges and discoveries. The fellowship program bearing my name would soon begin identifying emerging photographers who needed the support and recognition I had lacked. The exhibitions continued to travel to museums across the country, bringing visibility to workers whose contributions too often went unacknowledged. This was the life I had created from nothing but conviction and persistence, a life rich with purpose, connection, and the opportunity to reveal what others overlooked. A life that had transcended rejection to become something neither my parents nor my younger self could have imagined. And in that transformation lay the most profound vindication of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.